Here we are, pleasant afternoon, the birds are chirping. I wonder what they're saying. You and I will never know. Look, I'm going to compare apples and oranges today. You know, we all know the difference between an apple and an orange. Irrespective of genetic engineering, we still can tell the difference between an apple and an orange, and they're very, very different pieces of fruit. Now, it's fascinating when you listen to most commentators and politicians and corporate and business leaders and the corporate media apologists, and to a significant degree the government guild at ABC. They all seem to be singing from the same song sheet as far as applauding the private sector. Now, the last 40 years, the globalisation, privatisation, corporatisation and deregulation period of human history has been all about the private sector. Now, there is one fundamental difference between a public service and a private service. A public service is open to all citizens and permanent residents. A private service is only open to those segments of society that have the disposable income to purchase that service. Although, in Australia we have a curious mixture. We have the public sector subsidising the private sector to the tune of $8 billion in terms of the health insurance needs of this country. $8 billion of public funds go into the private health insurance company. We see it in terms of public education, where billions of dollars is given to the private sector. These are publicly funded gifts to organisations who theoretically are available to people who have the disposable income to buy those goods and services. Unfortunately, when the two are compared, whether it's public housing, public health, public education, public infrastructure, it's always the same report card. The private sector is way and above more efficient and better than the public sector. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at the public health sector and the private health sector, if you have a major health concern or involved in a major trauma and sustain significant injuries, you will, the majority of cases, whether you've got private health insurance or not, find yourself in the public sector, because the public health system has a far superior system, to the private health system. It's a far superior system in terms of emergencies. It may not be a superior system in terms of non-emergencies. And the difference between the public and private health sector, comparing apples and oranges, is that the private health sector cherry picks the patients it decides to admit or operate on. It needs to make a profit at the end of the day. And if it takes on complex cases, it'll find that it won't make a profit, irrespective of the government subsidies to the private health sector. So not only is the private health sector limited to the 40% of Australians who can afford to take out private health insurance, it's also limited, as far as that 40% is concerned, to those in that 40%, among that 40%, who have relatively easy elective or non-emergency who require easy elective or non-emergency services. So no wonder we find that the private health sector seems to have a better average than the public health sector. It doesn't have to deal with everybody. It can pick and choose who it treats and is publicly subsidised. We see this in the public education sector. Report after report, another one just a few weeks ago, highlights the lack of government funding to the public education sector. The public education sector is open to everyone, irrespective of degree of disability, irrespective of possible academic achievement. It is open to everyone. A private education is only open to those parents who have the disposable income to buy that education, which is subsidised by the public sector, subsidised by the government purse. So it's all very well to compare the results of the private sector in comparison to the public sector, but you're talking of a two-horse race where one horse finds itself 100 metres in front of the finishing line, while the other horse is 1,000 metres behind, at the start of the race, behind the finishing line. Lack of funds, the fact that it provides universal education, means that if you compare the private sector to the public sector as far as education is concerned, you will find that the private sector always has, or nearly always has, a better result, because it picks and chooses who will continue in that sector. So you can't compare apples and oranges. This is the same with public housing. It's all very well to say public housing is for people who are in an emergency situation, but ultimately public housing was designed for people who could not afford to buy private housing. The so-called housing affordability crisis we have is a manufactured crisis which has been manufactured through the destruction of the public housing sector. How can you have competition between the private and public sector when all the government funds are going to the private sector as far as housing is concerned, and slabs of public housing are being privatised, while others are allowed to run down so they can be closed and privatised? So again, you can't compare the public and private sector. The public sector theoretically is open to everybody who can't afford a house, but unfortunately it is now only limited to people in dire emergencies because of government policies. Now we can take this example into areas that have been fully privatised in the last 40 years. Aged care. Now aged care has been a disaster, and it has been a disaster for one very good reason, because it has been fully privatised. Not-for-profit groups have basically been forced to take on a private mentality in order to survive. And we see more and more elderly Australians losing the nest eggs they've created over a lifetime of work to a private aged care sector, which is big on advertising, but not big on providing the necessary care for people in these situations. And this is totally due to the privatisation, because privatisation of an essential asset means there is a third person in the bedroom. You don't just have the consumer and the organisation, which is publicly funded, providing the service, but you now have a third person in the bedroom who demands to make a profit from that service. And this is what happens when you privatise essential public infrastructure. And over the last 20 years, more and more Australians are beginning to realise that you can't compare apples and oranges. That the type of service they had before privatisation doesn't resemble the type of service they have now, which is based on creation of profits, normally for major shareholders, irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. We see this in the aged care sector. We see this in Australian ports. Can you imagine this is a country that has privatised its ports? In some situations, it's given 99-year leases to foreign governments over Australian ports. This is a country that has privatised its airports and handed them over to the private sector. This is a country that has allowed Transurban to create billions of dollars of profits at taxpayer expense with taxpayer subsidies for providing essential road networks. I mean, the fact that the Victorian state government was willing to extend for another 35 years the monopoly it held on the tunnel underneath the Yarra is an extraordinary situation. People expected that after the first 25-year lease that wouldn't be privatised, but because they put a few $1 billion into building a tunnel, which is basically a new tunnel, which is basically being built with taxpayers' dollars, we expect them to provide this service for an extraordinary profit. It's the same with private-public partnerships. You find in all public-private partnerships that it's the private sector which benefits from that partnership, not the public sector. Look at the ridiculous situation we found ourselves in during COVID-19, where we didn't even have a vaccine manufacturing centre. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratories was established in 1911 to provide vaccines for all Australians. It was privatised, I think, in 1992 for about $2.70 a share. It now is about $300 a share. I mean, to privatise essential services is total lunacy. And it's total lunacy for a variety of reasons. The first is when you're dealing with a large corporation, let's not forget that most of the essential services are now owned by private corporations, you as a customer have no political power, none whatsoever. All you can do is complain. The private company may respond, it may not respond. As we see over and over again, the lack of response in so many situations. If a company is publicly owned, theoretically you own that company because you're a citizen or a permanent resident. Theoretically you can apply political pressure to the government of the day to improve that company's service. Whether it was the Commonwealth Bank when it was in public hands, whether it was telecommunications when it was in public hands, when it was gas, when it was public hands, when it was electricity, when it was public hands. Today, we've seen the ludicrous situation where the second biggest gas exporter in the world didn't have enough gas to provide companies on the east coast of Australia because the government of the day, in its haste to make these corporations rich, didn't think about providing a quota of gas to companies on the east coast. The West Australian government, seeing what was going to happen, obviously did this. So it's a ludicrous situation. When something is privatised, especially large corporations, when essential services are privatised, we become hostages of that corporation. They have no fear. Look what Google did when the Australian government was trying to pass a little bit of legislation to regulate it. It closed down the network in Australia. And it would have left it closed if the government didn't back down. So instead of having a situation where we as citizens have power to influence a government which owns public assets, the privatisation of those public assets mean we no longer have power to influence government about those assets and about how and the costs involved to us to access those essential services. So it's a serious situation we find ourselves in. A very serious situation. Not only that, privatising profitable companies has meant that the revenue stream to the federal government has dried up extensively. It means that the profits that came from a public Commonwealth Bank or a public telecommunications network, or from electricity and gas facilities or hydroelectricity, go to shareholders. They no longer go to the Treasury and to the people of Australia to provide services for the people of Australia. So every time some apologist, and that's all they are, for the private sector, some apologist who is most likely paid by the private sector to ring their bell, every time you hear some apologist degrade the public sector, just remember, the public sector is for everyone. Every Tom, Dick, Harry, Maud, and etc. It's for everyone. The private sector is only for those who can afford those assets, to access those services and assets. When you have a situation where people are not eating because they haven't got enough resources, and let's not forget that 1/3 of Australians live below the poverty line, they live on social security benefits, when they don't have enough resources to access essential services, which are controlled by private corporations, which government have minimal power over, and which we have no power over, we begin to see the situation we find ourselves in Australia in 2023. The issue isn't the other, the person of a different colour, the person of a different religion, the person who wears different clothes, the person of different sexual orientation or gender. The issue is power. Who controls what? And if, as a corporation, you have the power to control essential services, what happens is profits skyrocket for those private corporations. The service that customers receive decreases. So let's not compare apples and oranges. The private sector is basically kept alive through public money, through us being forced to use their assets. There is no competition. You think there's competition, but when you look at the different services, whether it's communication, gas, electricity, petrol, ultimately there is no competition. The only time you have competition is when you're part of a mixed economy, when a strong public sector can compete with a private sector, allowing these monopolies to grow and grow and grow, and refusing to regulate them because governments are frightened of the consequences, has put us in the situation we find ourselves in. If you find this unacceptable and you want to join with like-minded people, I suggest you look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest website, pibci.net. Have a look at their constitution, and if you wish, you can join online, because ultimately change doesn't come from begging and beseeching. Change comes from people, like-minded people, coming together, organising to ensure what is best for us as a whole group of people, is what is best for the communities as a whole. Because if we don't become involved, what we've seen over the last 40 years, the corporatisation, globalisation, privatisation, deregulation monster will grow and grow and grow until corporations become the dominant political decision-making power in our society.